Mikael, can you hear me?
Ken, nice to meet you.
Hey, hello, good to see you, Mikael. So yeah, thank you for agreeing to have a little chat about your extremely successful summer course, The End of the World. And let me quickly introduce you. Mikael is a senior lecturer here at Uppsala University, and he runs this fantastic summer course, The End of the World. And coming from the volcano end, this is of course fascinating because the concept of super volcanoes causing a volcanic winter and changing the world as we know it dramatically is of course a very interesting exercise, and it's not unrealistic. It happened in the past, but you have a lot of other aspects that you're discussing about the end of the world, and I'm really glad to have you here today for a little chat. So this summer course that you're running, what are the options for causing the end of the world, Mikael?
Well, there are plenty of different scenarios. We have everything from various environmental disasters, such as extreme climate change and various forms of pollutions, to various forms of man-made disaster scenarios like nuclear holocausts or runaway technologies like nanotechnology or synthetic biology that can wreak havoc on the world in various ways, to classical things like pandemics, world wars, asteroid impacts, and various forms of natural disasters. So there are plenty of different visions people have formulated about large events that can essentially imply an existential risk for society.
There is these natural events like super volcanoes, what I'm very interested in, and of course bolide impacts, asteroid impacts, and there can be all sorts of large-scale climate change that we've seen without anthropogenic influence in the geological past, of course. Partly because of plate tectonics and things like that, and also other cosmic arrangements. We had snowball Earth. The Earth was a big kind of icy planet at some point in the past, so we believe at least. And well, it's not technically the end of the world. So I mean, the world is still going. It's the end of the world as it was at that time. So can any of these things really cause the end of the world before we plunge into the details of the phenomena?
Yes, definitely. There are a few really destructive scenarios, but it's also important to highlight that there are so many level of details that is very often forgotten in the debate around these things. What kind of actors are relevant? Is this the end of, for instance, a large country or even a specific species, or is it the end of essentially the entire planet of Earth? So those level of details are important to bring. And when we talk about these catastrophes, we have everything from anthropogenic risks caused by deliberate or accidental human activities and decisions. We also have natural risks and natural phenomena that can cause very disruptive and destructive impacts, both on a completely global level, but also at very large regional levels. We have everything from nearby supernovas could potentially be very problematic for the planet, but also super volcanoes and those kind of events. And then we have the final risk of so-called external risks relating to non-human, non-natural threats and events, and that's usually extraterrestrial invasions, divine interventions, and all of those peculiar wild cards, but they are usually the least discussed type of scenarios.
Well, alien invention is discussed certainly in Hollywood, but
Yeah.
I agree it's a bit of a wild card here. It's beyond what I think is my immediate concerns right now at least. So I remember you had this slide where you had an overview. Would you be able to share that?
Yes, definitely. If we look at some of the more
Yeah, that's
common
the one.
global catastrophic risks, these are usually highlighted as largest and most important risks, the so-called mainstream apocalyptic visions, if one may. Here we have extreme climate change, we have weapons of mass destruction in various forms, primarily nuclear weapons. We have global system collapse, either financial collapse or other forms of global systems that will be significantly disrupted. We have, of course, AI, synthetic biology, supervolcanoes, pandemics, many other things. And then in many cases, these risks can essentially interact in various ways, where, for instance, one event can make another event more problematic. If, for instance, you have weapons of mass destruction and in some way an AI would get hold of them, you could end up with a quite nasty potential outcome, which is explored in, for instance, the Terminator movies and was discussed quite a lot in the 1980s when people were concerned over robots becoming way too smart.
Well, robots are smart, and I think artificial intelligence is still a big discussion right now that that artificial intelligence may take over and consider us a little dim at some point, and therefore consider us as redundant even. So, well, maybe some of the human decisions, as Einstein said already, are not always the smartest. So you can see our worry for that. It's not, maybe jokingly, I would say it's not entirely unjustified. But yeah, so, but this kind of thing, these end of the world scenarios, I mean, many of them that you describe here have, of course, a natural basis. Other ones are of our doing and connect several aspects in a very unfortunate way for humans. But I would like to kind of go a step back before we go there. And that is when I think of asteroid impacts or supervolcanoes, there are very, very rare events. And the probability of something like this happening in our lifetime is just, it's just minuscule. So supervolcanoes, on average, there's hundreds of thousands of years in between supervolcano eruptions. So if you look at human lifetimes, I mean, we only came out of Africa about 73,000 years ago. So, I mean, when you think of the rhythm of supervolcanoes, this is something that I feel humans don't need to be concerned on a daily basis. And I went onto Wikipedia and I looked for doomsday predictions. And could I quickly share my screen if that's okay?
Yes.
And let's see whether I can get this up. Here we are. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
With the Wikipedia page. And yeah, so this is list of dates predicted for apocalyptic events, and this goes back, it's of course very strongly religiously influenced, but it starts here with initial predictions going back to 66 after Christ's birth. And just look with me through that list. It goes into the Middle Ages and into kind of modern times, and the list is just phenomenally long. All of these people made some end of the world prediction, and this goes on into modern times here. And certainly in terms of recording it, there's a lot more end of the world predictions here now, and doomsday scenarios and things like that. So it's a bit of a funny one, because I'm sometimes wondering, are we as a species a little bit obsessed with the end of the world? Are we just finding it somehow thrilling? And I'm sure it's a survival instinct as well that's maybe partly a little misguided. Are we over worried is my question. What do you feel about this?
I would say that it has always been a fascination of mankind to contemplate the end of the world or the apocalypse in various forms. And even in the oldest written sources, the texts of the Babylonian empires and so on, you can find apocalyptic visions. You have this in for instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls and many others. You have a lot of visions about the end of the world. So this seems to have been a kind of narrative that have captivated mankind for as long as we have written sources, and probably way before that as well. And we also know that in times of troubles, such as today or many other parts in history, thoughts about dystopias or explorative ideas about what could happen if we, for instance, continue on our current trajectories, something that becomes more common. So if you look at the intellectual debate in the West, intellectuals have essentially withhold the idea that the world is essentially in the final days. For the last 500 years, it was a very prevalent thought already during the Age of Enlightenment and so on, even though it was mostly a religious or supernatural event at that time. And we can see a gradual shift for the last 200-300 years towards more natural science-based visions of this impending doom.
Yes, and this is of course fascinating because it impacts on the current debate, and it also impacts on how we deal with climate change. And I think it's not a real strong discussion point any longer that humans are causing climate change. I think we can all agree on this, but I see a huge debate out there in terms of what is the right response to this. And certainly here in the department, here at the university, there's quite some different views on this. So, I mean, for some people, this is a question of adaptation. We just need to do the right things and then we can deal with this. For others, it is literally the end of the world, and it will be such a disaster that we cannot mitigate it anymore.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about this? I mean, this is not a sudden impact like an asteroid. It's something that's coming very gradually, and in a way we have response time, although some people of course make the point that we have waited too long already. And I'm a bit torn sometimes. I mean, while I see the causes, I'm not entirely sure always whether immediate rushed responses are the perfect answer to things. It's not what I would do in my life. But on the other side, not doing anything is also fundamentally flawed, I guess, if you see something coming.
Yeah.
What's your take on this?
I will share a slide that
Go
will
ahead, please.
highlight some of these issues. If we look at this concern over existential risk, and this includes everything from nuclear weapons to climate change, environmental destruction, it has always been an important part of the debate, and usually a very strong catalyst for kind of starting and initiating discussions around what we should do, what kind of future society should we strive for. And in many cases, these dramatic visions are also a very important part of the decision making. The concern over a very destructive, large-scale nuclear war, something that could annihilate about 3 billion people, with a very long nuclear winter in case Soviet and the US unloaded their strategic arsenal. It was a very important part of, for instance, the formulation of a lot of these arms reduction treaties and the concern over the increasing nuclear armament. Same thing as we see today, that the concern over rapidly increasing emissions of greenhouse gases are a very important part of the various political deals around decarbonization and reductions of emissions. So these kind of visions are important for triggering debate in various ways. And in some cases, whether these scenarios are realistic or not is not necessarily the most important thing with them. They can be there mostly as a catalyst for debate, as we usually have a lot of uncertainty and there tend to be quite a lot of speculation within some of these scenarios. But also we can see that some of these doom narratives can be hijacked by various groups to essentially cause rather problematic things. There are groups who engage in what is known as accelerationism. They kind of see the end of the world as unavoidable, and since it's unavoidable, we might as well help it on the way, because once everything is gone, we can finally construct our kind of ideal society from the ashes of the fallen world. It's usually those kind of narratives, and this is something that you can see in various social Darwinist groups or other things where they saw very radical measures as very important thing to avoid this very negative future, and it was used to justify a lot of rather problematic decisions. So doom narratives are important, and the debate around them are equally important.
It's fascinating you say that. It reminds me of this Old Norse concept of the end of the world, of Ragnarök, the end of time, where everything will get destroyed. All the gods will basically die, apart from one who will then start a new world, a new world of deities, and repopulate the earth. So this is almost religious in some way for certain people. I think the way you describe it, it certainly comes across this way. So yes, doomsday cults is an issue here, and I worry a little bit that humans, even those that are not part of major cults, may find this fascinating. Whether we are just as humans a little bit inclined towards this prediction of the end of the world, that we almost enjoy reveling in these concepts, and somehow maybe it makes us feel better about the present day. But I don't know. Do you think we are pre-programmed somehow to kind of look into it this way?
I definitely think so. Human beings kind of orient ourselves very much around different narratives. We use narratives and storytelling to make sense of the world. And since there is a start to something, thinking about the end of something is a quite natural thing. And then you can create a lot of rather interesting narratives around, for instance, what would happen in certain cases. And the fact that we have a large amount of blockbuster disaster movies and various
Yes.
apocalyptic movies is as a very important thing. Or you have very popular post-apocalyptic TV series like zombie movies or things like that. It's there, it's a very successful part of our cultural and popular culture because people are attracted and would like to know more or see more of these kind of things, even though it tends to be more focused on entertainment rather than scientific speculation in those cases. So
But
these kind of concerns are an important part of our culture.
it's interesting that you say that, because you said something earlier that maybe the actual factual basis is not always the key issue. Maybe it's that we deal with it, that we
Yeah,
get our heads around it, and even if it's
yeah.
just entertainment, it's a form of preparation. Because I've certainly been working in for example, Indonesia, where local legends have developed in order to warn future generations about certain hazards. Certainly, that's my interpretation of many of those local legends, and that it's almost a disaster catalog, and it's a little bit of a recipe how to deal with things, how to increase your resilience as a society. And maybe there is a much deeper meaning to disaster movies and blockbusters that describe the end of the world, because it makes us think, it makes us look at possibilities. What would we actually do if, and how would we handle this? Can we think about a possible way out? And while we use it for entertainment to a certain degree, it does make us more prepared, strangely enough. So there is a cultural value to this. Thank you very much. I have one last point, if you don't mind. Could I quickly share my screen, if that's all right for you?
Yes.
And that is actually, I have this list here, and share screen, and here we are. So I have this list here, and it's a list of what it's called here, failed doomsday predictions. It's not my list, obviously, but it's going through things from the last 50 years. And I find this fascinating and a little troublesome, actually. It troubles me a little in the sense that it says here in the 60s or late 60s, oil was considered an issue, and there was predictions that it will run out in 10 years. We still bring oil up from the ground. Then there was predictions about famines in the 70s, which, you know, it didn't really materialize in this sense. And then in the 70s, ice age by 2000. I seen on YouTube, I've seen clips where Mr. Spock, the actor of Mr. Spock, was warning for ice ages to come. And nowadays we have almost exactly the opposite. 50 years later, we are dealing with issues about global warming. And people in the 70s weren't idiots, so, but they had, of course, a different base of understanding. And if we go through this, then it seems in the 70s, ice age concerns were very big. New ice age, satellites show new ice age. The Earth is cooling. There was a scientific consensus, it says here. I haven't checked the details for each of those claims, but somebody must have put this list together. And then acid rain in the 80s, and peak oil, and then the list goes on into, let's see, oops, here. Here we see various kind of concerns. And then, of course, here it swings over in the 2000s towards warming, that children don't know, will not know what snow is. And then the famine thing comes back, and the Arctic will be ice-free by 2018. That was a prediction from 2008. And it goes on and on. So, and where is my button here? Stop share. So, and if we look back, only 50 years, and people weren't idiots, as I said. They were able to fly to the moon and handle nuclear weapons and things like that, with, well, more or less success. But, you know, are we a bit quick sometimes in worrying about the future? Are we getting things right? Or do you see this also part of an important debate that will then change with time?
Yeah, I think this is definitely an important part of the ongoing debate. And I would say that there is a lot of wisdom in this old statement that predictions are very hard, especially about the future.
Yes,
And I
you're
think
right.
to a large degree, it's very hard to make predictions for these events because you have very limited historical data. A lot of these scenarios usually rely on trend extrapolations. For instance, a concern over the population bomb that was supposed to drop in the 1970s. People were, for instance, predicting and projecting the birth rate at that time. It was very high, with usually more than 5 children per woman. And it was supposed to be a very important problem. And if you just make mathematical projections with the best available models at that time, it would indicate that we would have a significant problem with overpopulation, and people made very interesting movies such as Soylent Green around that time, when this idea with overpopulation was very dominant, and people even proposed very radical measures like temporary sterilants to be added to drinking water and so on, to kind of get the overpopulation concern under control. But then it turned out that roughly the same time as Paul Ehrlich published this book, The Population Bomb, and it became a major, well-read book at that time, population birth numbers started to drop globally, and we saw essentially a shift in fertility trends over the world, with increased education and changes in society that led to a lot less children being born. So the problem kind of disappeared. And if you're just extrapolating the historical trends, it's a completely sensible thing to do, but you kind of miss the very significant shift that occurred. So asking questions about the inertia of some of these historical trends, will they change very quickly, and how sensible, what are essentially the sensitivities of some of the assumptions that are built into some of these visions. In some cases, there are very significant uncertainties and you have high sensitivities in the systems. In some cases, you can have very stable trends and you can make somewhat more reasonable long-term projections. But in the end, it's a lot of speculation usually, and we need to focus more on what kind of assumptions and mechanisms that are being built into these models, and not really see them as black box models where people just create some kind of interesting or provocative output, and then you just focus on their essentially the date when the world will end, and then you focus on that, and not really on how they actually derive that particular date.
It does play with our worries, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
doesn't play with our fear centers in our brain and makes them light up. And in a
Yeah.
way, fear is often misjudged. It's not a bad thing per se. Nature gave us fear so that we can start doing things about it. But of course, we can also overstimulate it. And then we might be doing things out of fear, not necessarily because they're sensible. So to strike the balance between these things is, I think, the challenge we're facing. And
and I would also say that it's important to differentiate between predictive scenarios where you're trying to predict the most probable future outcome, and separate that from explorative scenarios where you kind of explore different possible futures. Of course, it is possible to see a lot of dramatic events in the future that would imply the end of the world, but if we can't really assign them probabilities, they are still very important food for thought, or to explore for instance, for scenario planning or things like that. But we should not really see them as a strong indication of what will happen with a huge, with almost certainty in the future. So probabilities and explorative scenarios are somewhat different things, and they are both concerned with the future, but they should be used for somewhat different things. And when you talk about all future issues, you usually have a lot of confusion between normative scenarios, the kind of futures we would like to see, and explorative scenarios that are just possible futures, and then predictive scenarios that are kind of the most probable futures that we are on our way to.
It's funny you say that. It reminds me just at the very end of this situation I was exposed to with National Geographic a few years ago. And in a way, I always looked for a situation to rectify that. So maybe I can use this here. It was about the collapse of La Palma Island and the possible mega tsunami, and that would go all the way to the Americas and hit Florida and New York. And of course, I stressed while they were filming, I stressed on many occasions, this scenario is not impossible, but the probability is absolutely tiny that we will experience this in our lifetimes. And when the final program was aired, they did have me say this on the program. It's a very tiny likelihood of this happening. And then the kind of narrator says, and now let's look what the worst case scenario would be. And bang, they plunged into this kind of thing. And of course, it was exactly what they wanted in the program. So this explorative scenario is what fascinates us, but the probability of this is what often gets a little bit sidetracked here. I think this is not something that we have intuitively a sense for, that we can distinguish between the exploration of a scenario and the probability of a scenario. And I think this is what many media outlets play with, so that we have a weakness there. We have a dark angle there, if you will, a blind spot. And this is very important to stress. Well, this was very interesting. I really enjoyed that discussion, Mikael. Thank you so much. Is there something you feel we haven't touched on that you think is critical to add?
And no, I think we covered everything pretty well here in our discussions, but otherwise, if people are around in Uppsala and think these kind of questions are important, sign up for our summer course.
That's great. I will actually put a link to the summer course into the text box underneath, so people can explore this. And I will also put a link to some of the sources, like the doomsday predictions on Wikipedia, and then hopefully people can get an impression themselves. And I think the important conclusion I take away from this is that doomsday predictions and scenarios are actually, of course, exploratory in a way, but also they are preparation. So they make us mentally prepared. And I actually come out of this discussion with respecting some of these things a little more than I used to. So thank you very much for shifting my mind a little on this, Mikael. This was very good. All the best for the end of the year, and hopefully not the end of the earth and the end of the world. And I'll see you again some point next semester when term starts again. Thanks for making time in the holidays, and all the very best to you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.